The man in the closet. Emily Carter had always prided herself on being independent. At 27, she had moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. The rent was cheap, the neighbors kept to themselves, and she finally had the space to live life on her own terms. But within the first few weeks, small things began to feel off. One evening, after a long shift at work, she came home and noticed her front door was slightly ajar. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Had she forgotten to lock it that morning? She was sure she had. She pushed the door open, peering inside cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of forced entry. Maybe she had just been careless. Still, the unease gnawed at her. She double-checked the locks that night. The next morning, she woke up to find her kitchen cabinet doors open. All of them. A chill ran down her spine. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had forgotten to close them. Maybe the air from the open window had moved them. She laughed nervously at herself, but deep down, a seed of fear was planted. Then, the truly unsettling things began. Emily kept a strict grocery routine. She knew exactly what she bought and how long it lasted. But over the next week, food started disappearing. A loaf of bread, half a carton of milk, a few apples. At first, she thought she might have been absent-minded. But when she found an empty yogurt cup sitting neatly in the trash can, one she knew she hadn't eaten, her stomach clenched. Someone had been in her apartment. The locks weren't broken. There were no signs of forced entry. But someone had been inside. She called her landlord, demanding to know if maintenance had entered without her permission. He assured her that no one had a spare key except him, and he hadn't sent anyone. That night, she shoved a chair under her front door handle and barely slept. The nightmares started. Emily would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain she had heard something. A creaking floorboard. A faint rustling sound. Once, she swore she heard breathing, soft, rhythmic, coming from somewhere inside her bedroom. She convinced herself it was just paranoia. Then, one night, as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone, she felt a shift in the air. Her closet door, which had been open just an inch, moved. It was slow, almost imperceptible. Her breath caught. She stared at the dark gap between the door and the frame. Was she imagining things? Or was there someone behind it? She grabbed her bedside lamp, heart pounding, and walked toward the closet. With a shaking hand, she threw the door open. Nothing. Just the usual clutter, jackets, shoes, storage boxes. But something in her gut told her she was being watched. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in her room. She started sleeping with the lights on, locking the bedroom door at night. Then, it happened again. One night, around 3 a.m., she woke up suddenly. The room was eerily quiet. She turned her head and froze. Her closet door was wide open. She stared at it, unable to move. Hadn't she closed it before bed? The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, using the flashlight to scan the darkness inside the closet. Something caught her eye, a faint indentation in the clothing hanging inside. As if someone had been standing there. That was the night she decided to buy a hidden camera. The next day, Emily bought a small, motion-activated camera and placed it in her bedroom, facing the closet. That night, she forced herself to sleep. When she woke up, the closet door was open again. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and checked the footage. At first, there was nothing. Just her tossing and turning in bed. Hours passed. Then, at 2:47 a.m., the closet door slowly, silently, began to open. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Then, a figure emerged. A man. Thin, pale, wearing tattered clothing. His eyes were sunken, his hair greasy and unkempt. He stepped out of the closet silently, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood over her bed, watching. For 2 hours. She never woke up. Then, as the sun began to rise, he slipped back into the closet and closed the door. Emily dropped the phone. Her entire body shook. He had been there the whole time. Living in her closet. Watching her sleep. Emily didn't think. She grabbed her keys, ran out of the apartment, and drove straight to the police station. The officers took her seriously, especially after seeing the footage. A team was dispatched to her apartment immediately. They found him, curled up inside the closet. A homeless man. He had been living inside her apartment for weeks, sneaking out at night to steal food before slipping back into the shadows before morning. But the worst part, when they searched the closet, they found something else. A small hole in the back wall. Behind it was a crawl space. Inside, there was a nest of blankets, food wrappers, and notebooks filled with incoherent writings. He had been living inside her walls. 4 months. Emily moved out immediately. She couldn't bear to set foot in that apartment ever again. But the damage was done. She couldn't sleep in the dark anymore. Every creak, every whisper of wind sent her into a panic. The thought that someone had been watching her, standing over her while she slept for hours, it never left her. The worst part? The police told her he wasn't the first. The building had a history of squatters living inside the walls. Other tenants had reported strange occurrences, but no one had ever investigated. He could have done something worse. He could have hurt her. But he didn't. He just watched. Final thoughts. This story is based on real-life cases where people have discovered intruders living inside their homes without their knowledge. These situations are far more common than people realize, making them all the more terrifying. The Black-Eyed Woman. Javier Morales had been a taxi driver for nearly a decade. He had seen all kinds of passengers, drunken partygoers, businessmen too busy on their phones to talk, and even a few celebrities. But nothing prepared him for the woman he picked up that night. It was past 2 a.m., and he was about to finish his shift when he spotted her standing at the edge of a dimly lit street near the outskirts of town. She wasn't at a designated pickup spot, and there were no houses or businesses nearby. Just a stretch of road leading into the woods. She wore a long, dark hooded coat that concealed most of her face. Her posture was stiff, her hands hidden in her pockets. Something about her made Javier uneasy, but work was work. He pulled over and rolled down the window slightly. "Where you headed?" A long pause. Then, in a whispery voice, she said, "Take me to the city." Javier hesitated. "Which part?" Silence. Then, softly, "Anywhere." A shiver ran down his spine, but he unlocked the door. The woman slid into the back seat, moving strangely, almost robotic. As he pulled onto the road, an uncomfortable silence settled in. Then, he glanced at the rearview mirror. And his blood ran cold. The woman was sitting completely still, her face angled downward, her hood still covering most of her features. But what caught his attention was her hands, long, bony fingers with ragged, dirt-streaked nails. His pulse quickened. Something was off. He cleared his throat. "So, rough night?" She didn't respond. As they drove under the glow of a streetlight, Javier's hands gripped the wheel tighter. Her reflection in the mirror didn't match her posture. His stomach twisted. It was subtle, but in the mirror, she looked like she was facing forward, staring directly at him. But when he glanced back, her head was still tilted down. His foot hovered over the brake. He was about to ask her to leave when, suddenly, she spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" His breath caught in his throat. "What?" he muttered. The woman slowly lifted her head. And as they passed under another streetlight, Javier saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes were completely black. Javier's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he caught sight of her black, soulless eyes in the mirror. No whites. No pupils. Just pure darkness. His breath hitched, and his entire body went rigid. His instinct screamed at him to pull over, to get this woman out of his car, but his hands felt frozen to the wheel. She was still staring at him. Unblinking. The air inside the taxi grew heavier, colder. It felt as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in seconds. His own breath became visible in the mirror. Javier swallowed hard. Are you feeling okay? No response. The woman didn't move. Didn't blink. His heart pounded in his chest. He forced himself to look away from the mirror and focus on the road ahead. He needed to think. Maybe she had some kind of medical condition. Maybe she was wearing black contact lenses as a prank. But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. A few miles ahead, he spotted a gas station. It wasn't much, just a dimly lit convenience store and a couple of pumps, but it was his best chance to get out of this situation. I need to stop for gas, he muttered. Still, no response. He pulled into the lot, his tires crunching over the gravel. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead made everything feel surreal, like a scene from a nightmare. He put the car in park, exhaled shakily, and turned around. The back seat was empty. His stomach dropped. His mind raced. How? He hadn't heard the door open. Hadn't felt the car shift from someone stepping out. She was just gone. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone, checking the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see her black-eyed stare still fixed on him. Nothing. He stepped out of the car, glancing around the gas station. The lot was deserted. The road was empty. There was nowhere she could have gone. The air was thick with silence, except for the buzzing of the overhead lights. Then, his phone vibrated in his hand. A message. From an unknown number. His breath caught as he read the text. You should have kept driving. His blood turned to ice. Slowly, he looked back at the taxi. The back door was open. Javier's heart slammed against his ribs as he stared at the open back door of his taxi. He hadn't heard it open. Hadn't seen it move. And yet, there it was, gaping, waiting. A freezing chill crawled up his spine. The night air felt thick, suffocating. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and uneven. Slowly, he stepped toward the car, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He peered inside. Empty. But something felt different. The back seat was damp. The air inside the car smelled of earth and decay, like something that had been buried for far too long. His stomach twisted. He took a deep breath, reached for the door handle. Thud. A loud bang shook the roof of the taxi. Javier jerked back, his heart nearly stopping. His eyes darted upward. Nothing. The roof was bare. His breath came in short gasps now. His instinct screamed at him to leave. But then, his phone vibrated again. Another text. From the same unknown number. Don't look behind you. Javier froze. His body locked up, every muscle stiffened. He could feel it now, a presence. Standing right behind him. He didn't dare move. Didn't dare breathe. Then, ever so softly, he heard it. A whisper. Right by his ear. You should have kept driving. A jolt of terror shot through his body. Javier spun around. The gas station lot was empty. But just beyond the dim glow of the streetlights, on the side of the road. She was there. Standing perfectly still. watching. Her black, empty eyes locked onto him. The hood of her coat barely concealed her twisted, unnatural smile. Javier stumbled backward, his pulse hammering. He scrambled into the taxi, slammed the door shut, and fumbled to start the engine. The car roared to life, and he sped off, gravel spraying behind him. But as he drove away, his phone vibrated one last time. His hands trembled as he glanced at the screen. One final message. You can't outrun me. Javier drove like a madman. His pulse pounded in his ears. His hands trembled on the wheel. The streetlights blurred past as his taxi sped down the empty highway, but no matter how far he went, the icy fear clung to his chest. He glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The road behind him was deserted, nothing but darkness stretching into the night. For the first time in what felt like hours, he exhaled. Maybe it's over. But then, a new smell filled the car. Rot. A deep, earthy stench, thick and suffocating, like something pulled from a grave. Javier gagged, one hand flying to his nose. He nearly swerved off the road before regaining control. What the hell? He looked down. The passenger seat was wet. A dark, inky liquid seeped into the fabric, spreading slowly, soaking into the upholstery. Javier's breath caught. He reached out with a shaking hand, barely grazing the damp spot with his fingertips. It was cold. Sticky. Like thickened blood. His phone buzzed. Javier swallowed hard and glanced at the screen. Another text. Check your arm. His stomach dropped. Slowly, he looked down at his left arm. His sleeve was damp. Dark streaks of the same black liquid were smeared across his skin. His pulse skyrocketed. His chest tightened. He hadn't touched anything, hadn't brushed against the seat. So how the hell was it on him? His hands began to shake violently. He wiped at the stain, but the liquid wouldn't come off. It felt thicker now, heavier, like it was sinking into his skin. Then, the radio crackled. At first, it was just static. A soft, almost whispering noise beneath the fuzz. Then, through the distortion, a voice. Low. Hollow. You brought me with you. Javier slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a stop in the middle of the deserted road. His breath came in ragged gasps. He frantically wiped at his arm again, but the stain had vanished. The radio fell silent. The car fell silent. For a long moment, Javier just sat there, trembling, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. And then, his blood ran cold. In the mirror, the back seat wasn't empty anymore. She was there. Smiling. Javier's heart stopped. The black-eyed woman sat in the back seat, her head slightly tilted, her thin lips curling into a grotesque smile. His hands turned to ice on the steering wheel. His breath caught in his throat. But he couldn't turn around. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to jump out of the car, to get away. But he was paralyzed. His mouth open, a shaky breath escaping. She shouldn't be there. She had vanished. He had seen the back seat empty. So how was she sitting there now? Slowly, his trembling hand reached for the door handle. But the second his fingers touched it, the locks clicked. His phone vibrated. Another message. From the same unknown number. Drive. Javier let out a sharp breath, his hands clenching the wheel. No, he whispered. Get out of my car. A horrible creaking sound filled the air. Javier watched in horror as the woman's jaw began to stretch, distorting unnaturally. Her grin widened. Far too wide. The skin around her lips split, revealing jagged, blackened teeth beneath. And then, she whispered. Drive. Javier slammed his foot on the gas. The taxi lurched forward, tires screeching as he sped down the empty road. The car's interior grew darker. The headlights barely illuminated the pavement ahead. The streetlights overhead flickered, dimming as he passed. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Javier gritted his teeth, his hands trembling against the wheel. The whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't just from her. It was coming from everywhere. From the radio. From the vents. From the very air around him. You shouldn't have stopped. You shouldn't have picked her up. You shouldn't have looked back. Javier's vision blurred. His chest tightened, panic suffocating him. The road ahead seemed endless. No turns. No intersections. No sign of the city. Just blackness. His phone vibrated again. Hands shaking, he glanced at the screen. A single word. Look. His blood turned to ice. The rearview mirror. She was leaning forward now. Her face inches from his own. Her black, empty eyes bore into his. Her lips twitched. You can't get rid of me. Javier screamed. Javier's scream choked in his throat as he swerved violently, nearly losing control of the taxi. The car's tires skidded on the pavement, but he forced himself to grip the wheel, steadying it just in time. His heart slammed against his ribs. He refused to look in the mirror again. He couldn't. She was too close. Her black, rotting breath ghosted over his ear. The road ahead stretched into endless darkness. Javier's hands shook violently as he pressed the gas pedal harder. But no matter how fast he went, the headlights barely cut through the thick, unnatural night. There were no turns. No signs. No landmarks. As if the world beyond the road had ceased to exist. Then, his phone vibrated. Another message. You're almost there. His stomach dropped. Almost where? The whispers grew louder. From the vents. From the speakers. From her. A chorus of voices, overlapping, warping, becoming something inhuman. You let her in. You can't leave now. She's part of you. Javier shook his head violently. No. No, this isn't real. This isn't real. A low giggle came from the back seat. Not her voice. Something deeper. Something wrong. He couldn't take it anymore. He slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched. The taxi jerked forward, throwing him against the wheel. And for the first time in what felt like forever, everything was silent. No whispers. No voices. Just the soft, ticking sound of the engine cooling down. Javier sat there, panting. His entire body was soaked in sweat. His hand still clutched the wheel in a death grip. Slowly, his eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. His breath caught. He turned, almost afraid to look. She was gone. His chest rose and fell sharply. His mind raced. Had it been a hallucination? A stress-induced nightmare? Maybe he had imagined it all. He grabbed his phone with trembling fingers. Opened his messages. The conversation with the unknown number was gone. No texts. No record of the calls. Nothing. A long exhale shuddered out of him. It was over. It had to be. He just needed to get home. With a deep breath, he restarted the engine. The radio crackled. Soft static filled the car. Then, a distorted voice. Look at your arm. Javier's heart stopped. He slowly pulled up his sleeve. His skin was black. The same inky stain from before. But this time, it was spreading. Javier's breath hitched in his throat. The black stain crept up his arm, tendrils of inky darkness slithering across his veins like a living thing. His skin tingled, burned, as if something beneath it was squirming. He clawed at it. Rubbed. Scraped. But it wouldn't come off. It was inside him. His stomach churned. His vision blurred. The taxi engine hummed beneath him, waiting. But something felt wrong. The air inside the car was thicker now, suffocating. The smell of rot curled in his nostrils. The radio crackled again. A single whisper. Drive. Javier froze. Slowly, his shaking fingers reached for the rearview mirror. His reflection wasn't his own anymore. His eyes. They were black. Just like hers. A sharp knock at the window made his heart lurch. He turned, pulse hammering. Outside, through the windshield, a woman stood in the dark. A young woman. Soaked from the rain. Shivering. She looked desperate. Hopeful. She tapped on the glass again. Taxi. Javier's lips parted. He tried to speak. To warn her. To scream. But his throat wouldn't move. His hands, no longer his own, reached for the meter. The red light flickered to life. Fare accepted. His fingers curled around the wheel. A voice rose from his lips. Soft. Hollow. Not his. Where to? The woman smiled. Opened the door. And got in. Javier's foot pressed the gas. The taxi rolled forward, disappearing into the night. And the black stain spread. The end. The missing hours. David Harper woke up on a parked bench, his body shivering against the cold. His head throbbed. His mouth was dry. Something felt wrong. He sat up slowly, blinking against the early morning light filtering through the trees. Why am I here? The last thing he remembered was leaving his office late at night. He had checked his watch, 10:37 p.m. He'd stepped outside, pulled his coat tighter against the chill, and started his usual walk home. And then, nothing. A black void in his memory. Now, he was waking up in a park, the sun already rising. A quick glance at his watch made his stomach drop. 6:13 a.m. Almost 8 hours, gone. No memory. No explanation. His pulse quickened. He patted his pockets, his wallet, his phone, his keys, all still there. No signs of an attack. No bruises. No cuts. No blood. Just a horrible, gnawing sense of dread. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, dozens of missed calls and texts. His girlfriend, Emily. David, where the hell are you? It's midnight. I'm freaking out. Answer me. His best friend, Mike. Dude, this isn't funny. Call someone. And then, a single text from an unknown number. Did you see them? David's hands shook. His mind reeled. See who? Then, as he stared at the screen, his phone vibrated again. Another message. They're still watching. A chill ran down his spine. Slowly, heart pounding, David looked up. Across the street, beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, stood a figure. Tall. Motionless. Staring directly at him. David's breath hitched as he stared at the motionless figure across the street. They stood unnaturally still, their face obscured by the flickering light. Something about them felt wrong. His fingers tightened around his phone. Then, the street lamp above the figure blinked out. For half a second, darkness swallowed the street. When the light flickered back on, the figure was gone. David's stomach twisted. A cold, creeping sense of dread crawled up his spine. His phone vibrated. Another text. From the unknown number. You need to move. Now. David's chest tightened. He glanced around, his pulse hammered. The streets were empty, too empty. The early morning should have brought joggers, commuters, someone. But there was no one. He shoved his phone into his pocket and hurried down the sidewalk, his footsteps echoing against the silent buildings. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His mind raced. Where had he been for the last 8 hours? Who sent those messages? And who was that figure? Then, just as he turned a corner, a shadow moved. A tall, thin figure stepped out from an alleyway. David froze. They were wearing all black. No face. No details. Just a shape. And then, another. Emerging from the other side of the street. And another. And another. Silent. Still. Watching. David's chest tightened. He took a step back. Then. They moved. All at once. Rushing toward him. David spun on his heel and ran. David sprinted down the street, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures moved without sound. No footsteps. No breathing. Just shadows gliding toward him. His mind screamed, this isn't real, this isn't happening. But it was. He cut through an alleyway, his shoes skidding against wet pavement. The walls felt too close, pressing in on him. A dumpster. A fire escape. No way out. His phone buzzed. He barely glanced at it as he ran. Another text. Don't go home. David's blood ran cold. Home was exactly where he had planned to go. He burst onto a side street, scanning for anyone, any sign of life. Empty. Too empty. Like the city had been, wiped clean. Then, his phone buzzed again. Stop running. They like it when you run. David stumbled to a halt. His stomach twisted. Slowly, he turned. The street behind him was empty. The figures were gone. Vanished. He swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. He needed to think. Fast. He couldn't go home. He couldn't call the police, what would he even say? And he still had no idea what had happened to him in those missing hours. Then, his phone vibrated again. But this time, it wasn't a text. It was a photo. His hands shook as he opened it. A picture of himself. Lying on the ground. Eyes open. Staring. His blood turned to ice. That picture was taken last night. During the hours he had no memory of. David's chest tightened. A cold whisper slithered through his mind. What if I never woke up? Then, from the shadows behind him, a voice. You were never supposed to leave. David's body locked up. The voice, low, cold, almost mechanical, rippled through his bones. He spun around. The street was empty. But the air felt wrong. Heavy. Thick. Like something unseen was watching. His phone buzzed. Another text. Don't turn around again. His throat tightened. His instinct screamed at him to run. But then, the streetlights above him flickered. And in the sudden flashes of darkness, he saw them. Figures. Not just one or two anymore. Dozens. Lining the sidewalks. Looming in doorways. Standing impossibly still. He blinked. The lights flickered back on. They were gone. David's chest heaved. His pulse pounded in his ears. He was losing his mind. But then he noticed something. His shadow. It was stretching the wrong way. Not toward the streetlights, but away from them. Like something else was casting it. Something standing directly behind him. His entire body turned to ice. Slowly, so slowly, he raised his phone, switching to the front camera. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then, he tapped it. The image loaded. And David's breath stopped. There was a face behind him. Not a person. Not even something human. A gaping, hollow void where eyes should be. A mouth stretched too wide, as if screaming silently. And hands, *** long, spindly fingers, *** reaching for his shoulders. His phone buzzed again. A single message. You were never alone. David dropped his phone. And the streetlights went out. Darkness swallowed the street. Not the kind of darkness from a simple power outage, this was different. Thicker. Heavier. Like it was alive. David couldn't see his own hands. Couldn't see the ground beneath him. Couldn't see them. His breath came in short, panicked bursts. Then, the whispers began. Low. Indistinct. All around him. Too many voices to count. Some sounded distorted, inhuman. Others, familiar. His mother. His best friend, Mike. Even his own voice. All whispering in unison. You were never supposed to leave. David's stomach twisting. His foot inched backward. A cold hand closed around his wrist. His body locked up. It was too long, too thin. Fingers like bone. David screamed. The grip tightened. The whispers grew into a deafening roar. Come back. Then, a burst of light. David hit the ground hard, gasping. The streetlights were back. The whispering was gone. His wrist, empty. He scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. The street was silent. The figures, gone. Had they ever been there? David's gaze darted down. His phone lay on the pavement, screen cracked. One message, waiting. From the unknown number. You're running out of time. His stomach sank. Then, he noticed something else. The sky. The sun had stopped rising. It was still dawn. Exactly as it had been when he first woke up. Time hadn't moved. His watch still read 6:13 a.m. His phone, the same. His missing hours, they hadn't ended. They were still happening. And he was trapped inside them. David's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The world around him felt off. The air was too still. The city, too quiet. Time had stopped moving. He was still trapped in the missing hours. His phone buzzed. A new message. You need to remember. David's pulse pounded. Remember what? The streetlights above flickered. The air grew colder. And then, he heard it. A sound, far away at first. A distant, inhuman wail. Low. Echoing. Then, footsteps. Not normal footsteps. Heavy. Wet. Wrong. Like something dragging itself closer. David's stomach knotted. Slowly, he turned. And froze. Down the street, under the flickering lights, something was moving. Not walking. Not running. Gliding. A tall, shifting figure of pure darkness, its limbs elongating and twisting as it moved. No face. No eyes. Just an open mouth, gaping wide. A horrible, rasping breath filled the air. And then, it spoke. Not in words, but in echoes. David's own voice, repeating from the darkness. Help me. His own scream. His own whispers. It was repeating him. His phone buzzed again. His shaking hands lifted it. One final message. You never left. You just forgot. David's entire body went cold. Then, memories came flooding back. The alleyway. The attack. Hands grabbing him. Dragging him. A black void swallowing him whole. The missing hours. They weren't missing. He was. He had never escaped. He had never woken up. This wasn't the real world. It was the place in between. And the thing standing in the darkness. It had come to take him back. David's mind fractured. The truth hit him like a hammer. He had never left. The world around him, asterisk asterisk, the empty streets, the frozen time, the flickering lights, asterisk asterisk, none of it was real. He was still inside the missing hours. And the thing in the darkness? It had come to finish what it started. The figure lurched forward, its elongated limbs cracking and twisting unnaturally. David stumbled back. His breath came in shallow gasps. His phone buzzed one last time. A final message. Run. The figure lunged. David bolted. His feet pounded against the pavement, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air grew thick, suffocating. Behind him, the thing didn't run. It simply closed the distance. Moving faster than it should. Faster than anything human. David's vision blurred. The buildings warped. The sky swirled into blackness. Everything around him was melting, twisting, unraveling. Like the world itself was collapsing. Then, a door. Right in front of him. A door that shouldn't have been there. Without thinking, he grabbed the handle and threw it open. Blinding light exploded around him. And suddenly, he was waking up. The real world. David's eyes snapped open. He was lying on his bedroom floor. His phone buzzed beside him. His heart thundered in his chest. Morning light streamed through his window. Real morning light. His watch ticked forward. 6:14 a.m. The missing hours were over. Or were they? David sat up slowly. His entire body trembled. Everything looked normal. But something felt wrong. His phone buzzed. A final message. From the unknown number. You made it back. But not all of you. David's blood ran cold. He swallowed hard, hands shaking as he slowly turned toward the mirror. And when he saw his reflection, he screamed. Because the man staring back at him wasn't him. The end.